بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Dear students, this is our fourth recorded lecture in public finance. As you know, in the last 3 weeks we talked about taxes as the main source of government finance. And however, the taxation is the dominant form of government finance, but there are other forms that can be used to finance government activities. In today's lecture, we will talk about other sources of financing government activities apart from taxation. So as usual, let's start the lecture by talking about the learning outcomes. Today we aim at identifying other sources of government finance and explaining how government create inflation to finance their public expenditure. And also we'll talk about how user charges are applied and explain how donation and public enterprises are used in government finance. And finally, we will talk about the usage of public debt to finance a government expenditure. So, now what are the different forms of government finance apart from taxation? Here we can classify the other forms of government finance into 5 categories, which are inflation tax or government-induced inflation, and government enterprise, user charges, donation, and debt finance. So the current lecture will cover all these forms that are used to finance government activities. Now let's start with the first form of government finance of its activities, which is induced inflation. Let's remember what is meant by inflation. As you have studied in the previous courses such as money and banking and macroeconomics, inflation could be defined as continuous increase in the prices due to the expansion or the increase of the money supply. So now how can government use inflation to finance their activities? Simply, government will ask the central bank to print money to pay for its costs. What's the problem here? The problem is that when money supply increases without increasing the production level, this will lead to higher prices, and of course we will end up with higher inflation rates. And this will have bad consequences on both consumption and savings. And it will have the same impact such as taxation. So when the value of our money decreases, we call it inflation tax. Why? Because here the inflation will act like the tax. How this could happen? Let's talk about how inflation will affect consumption and saving, and compare it with the impact of taxation. For consumption, higher inflation will lead to a decrease in the purchasing power of money. So people now can buy lower amounts of goods and services. This means that the demand on private goods will be lowered and the resources will be transferred from private use to government use. On the other hand, for savings, inflation will also decrease the real value of accumulated savings held by citizens, which means that they will have a decrease in their wealth. If we compare this impact with the impact of taxation, we find that they are similar. As we have seen, higher inflation created by the government led to lower consumption and savings level and had the same impact such as taxation. But we should know that this method of financing public expenditure should be used only for short periods and shouldn't last for long periods. Why? Because if inflation continues for long periods, individuals will avoid holding domestic currency because it loses its value, and they will try to find other forms of wealth, such as holding precious metals such as gold, or sometimes they will tend to hold foreign currencies such as dollar. Um, this is known as currency substitution, which means that individuals or citizens of one country hold the currency of another country beside their domestic currency or instead of it. And dollarization is one form of currency substitution when individuals hold US dollar. So as I mentioned, an increase or expansion in money supply without an adequate increase in the output will lead to increasing inflation. This figure shows us the relationship between the inflation rate and the money supply growth rate over the period 1974 to 1990. During this period, the public deficit was very high, and for this reason, government tried to use induced inflation to finance this deficit by printing more money. So, as we can see in the figure, this period witnessed sharp fluctuations in the money supply growth rates, and also we can see that there is a clear association between inflation rate and the rate of growth of money supply, which means that the increase in money supply led to higher inflation rate at this time. So we can conclude that the central bank used its instrument to finance the public deficit. And as we know, when inflation increases, this leads to a decrease in the purchasing power of money. So at this period, we have a decline in the purchasing power of the Egyptian pound, which led the Egyptians to shift to other forms of wealth, such as precious metal and dollar. And if we look at the data of the percentage of dollar deposits to total deposits in the Egyptian economy at this period, we can find that it's more than 50%. So more than 50% of total deposits at banks was dollar deposits. And of course, this is an indication of currency substitution or dollarization in the Egyptian economy at this period. Now let's talk about the second form of government finance of its activities, which is government enterprises. Government often run commercial and industrial enterprises and sell private goods and services to raise revenues. And as you know, the difference between the revenues and expenses of these enterprises can be used to finance government spending. The third form of government finance of its spending is the user charges. What are user charges? They are the prices determined through political rather than market interaction. This means that these prices are determined by non-market rationing, as you have studied in chapter 1. Well, these charges can finance government supplied goods and services only when it's possible to exclude individuals from enjoying their benefits unless they pay the fee. What does this mean? For example, if you don't pay the fare of passing certain highways, then you will not be able to use this road. Or if you don't purchase the ticket of a public bus, then you cannot ride this bus, and so on. Well, user charges often help to finance such government supplies services such as highways, bridges, and they can be applied using different forms. What are the different forms of user charges? First is direct prices associated with the consumption of particular goods and services, such as the fees of public transportation in terms of bus or railway tickets. Second is the fees for the option to use certain facilities or services provided by the government, such as fees for using public parks. Third is a special assessment on privately held property. What does this mean? It means that imposing a property tax on special properties, where the owners of such properties have to pay this tax as they benefit from specific local infrastructure projects, such as the construction of new roads or the maintenance of current roads. Fourth is licenses to practice special activities such as driving licenses. And finally, fares or tolls such as fees imposed on using highways and bridges. Now, the question is, what are the advantage and disadvantage of applying user charges? One advantage is that they make those who directly consume the services pay for at least part of the costs of producing these services. Also, user charges ration the use of public facilities to avoid overcrowding. However, one of the limitations of using user charges is that they prevent the poor from using government supplied services. Now let's move to the fourth source of financing public expenditure, which is donations. What are donations? They are voluntary contributions paid to government from individuals and organizations, and they are usually used to finance specific programs. For example, when there is a natural disaster such as earthquake, governments may set up special funds to finance aid to victims of this disaster, and also to help people in difficulty, and also to deal with coronavirus. Many governments asked businesses and individuals to donate in special funds. Usually in war times, citizens of many nations donate to support the war effort, and also in peace times, individuals contribute with their times for providing specific public services for certain group of people, maybe minorities or people in needs. And also businesses and individuals can contribute in providing public goods such as roads and parks. Now let's move to the final form of financing public expenditure, which is debt finance. What is debt finance? It is the use of borrowed funds to finance government expenditure, which means that government borrow from individuals, firms, and maybe from banks. Then government will use these funds to finance their activities. Here we have some questions. First question is that how governments borrow, and second question is what is the benefit for those who lend the government, and the third question is are those lenders enforced to lend the government? So let's start by the first question, which is how government borrow. In this form of finance, usually governments issue bonds or some other note of government indebtedness, such as the treasury bills. And when government issue or sell these securities, government promises to repay the amount of the principal as well as its interest at some future date, which means that individuals and firms who purchase these government notes or securities will benefit from receiving interest payments in the future. And this also means that they are or they choose to lend the government. There is no enforcement here. This also means that they when they buy these notes, they are trying to achieve their self-interest by getting return on their savings. Then next point is how government repay the debt and its related debt service. What is debt service? It consists of all the required cash that should be paid to cover the repayment of interest and the principal on a debt for a particular period of time. The debt service consists of the principal, which is the initial value of the loan, as you know, plus the interest payments and any other expenses such as any fees associated with such financing arrangements. So, as the debt is paid off by the government, some form of alternative finance is necessary unless the government decides to retire the debt through issuance of additional debt. What does this mean? It means that when the government is required to pay the loan and its related service payments, it needs some funds. Sometimes governments borrow again to be able to repay the debt service, and in other times government increases taxes to be able to pay the debt service. This means that the debt finance can be used to postpone or delay the burden of taxation to future generation. We will have an example to clarify this point. Well, to clarify the idea, assume that in 2010, government planned to invest in building new schools or hospitals. So one way to finance such projects is to increase taxes. And if government imposes new taxes now, this means that individuals who live now would be forced to decrease their current consumption and savings, as I have explained before. For this reason, government may try to find another method to finance these projects rather than taxation. Another point is that, as you can imagine, the constructions of such public projects may take long years, which implies that people who live now will not benefit from these projects that will be fully constructed and functioning in 22, for example. So, in terms of fairness, this means that taxing people who live now is not fair and contradicts with the benefits principle that we covered last week. To avoid this unfairness, assume that government will not increase taxes. Then, how can government build these new projects? One way to finance these projects is to borrow the required funds by using bonds. Then this loan should be repaid along with its interest payments later on, which means that government needs to find some funds to repay this debt. The question is, when it's time of repayment, how can government acquire the necessary funds to repay the debt? Government can do this using two ways. First, a government can issue new bonds, which means that it will borrow again, and then the borrowed funds will be used to pay part of the old loan. The other way is to impose taxes when these projects are fully constructed, and this arrangement will be fair. Why? Because people who live after the construction of these projects can enjoy the services of these roads and hospitals, schools. So if government collect more taxes from them by increasing tax rate or by expanding tax base, this will be fair. So as we can see, this means that by using debt finance, government can delay the tax burden to future generation who will benefit from such public projects. Well, to sum up, the rationale behind using debt finance to finance investment projects is that usually these projects can take many years to be implemented and future generations will benefit from such projects. So fairness requires that future generation should pay the cost of these services, not current generation. This is the end of the lecture, and I much hope that you understood it well. So goodbye for now, and see you next week.